Welcome, everybody. I'm Ed Friedman, a chair of Friends of Meeting Bay, as most of you know. Thank you for coming. We are a unique organization in that we take a holistic look at the environment and holistic actions around the environment. And seeing the duck slide, Martin? Hello? Anyone hear me, Martin?
Yes, Ed.
Okay, thank you. Sound check, All right. So, yeah, so these are things we do: research, advocacy, conservation, education. We just, as an example, and I'll go through some different slides of these here right now, and then I'll introduce our speaker. We are recording tonight, and we do record these presentations. If you don't want to be recorded, you could leave. And within a couple of few days or so, Martin will have the recording up on the website, and I will show you where as we go through these. And so thank you, Martin, for doing this and for all you do with our website. Martin's our primary website coordinator. And we'll want to check to make sure my phone is off, Martin, your phone is off, Lincoln's phone is off, hopefully. And yeah, so moving on. A little bit dated example of some of the research that we do. We've been also doing a lot of work with PFAS. We've just started our bald eagle nest survey for this year. We'll be counting shad below the Brunswick Dam in a few weeks when they show up. That's a situation where the sonar we're using can show up to 10,000 shad coming in on one tide, and they got no place to go because that fish ladder is ineffective. So we're working on, and a lot of the work we do is on getting back migratory fish passage and ensuring it's safe. We're just starting our water. Sunday is our first day of water quality monitoring for this year. And we do that on the Kennebec up to Hollowell. And we're doing that now on the Androscoggin, really up to Gulf Island Pond, sort of part of that's sort of an ancillary program, but our main program goes up to Durham and down to South Bath. So a lot of advocacy work, as I mentioned, worked on fish restoration areas here and ensuring safe fish passage. We're doing all we can to get fish passage back, and we have been successful over the years in a number of these areas. So yes, education. Yesterday we had our Spring Bay Day, where we had 170 fourth graders from around the bay, Pittston, Randolph, Bath, Phippsburg, Woolwich, all gathered at the Chop Point School in Woolwich and had a great day of hands-on environmental education, getting everyone running around and happy and smiling and learning and getting dirty doing it. And we had about 50 volunteers there. So it's a wonderful day. And we do that in the fall as well. And we do some in-school stuff as well. And we've protected over probably 1,500 acres of land by now around the bay, about 13 miles of shoreline, as I recall. Just acquired a piece of land in North Bath that we're working on. That's about 30 acres of upland and was really savagely clear cut, much of it by the former owner. So we're trying to jumpstart restoration there. It's a project for the next generation. And it's protecting also about 90 acres of critical highest value wildlife habitat in terms of tidal wetland. And where our recordings go is the homepage of our current website. Martin's been working on a new website, which will probably be up, I don't know, later this summer or in the fall sometime in WordPress, but this one is in Dreamweaver. And if you scroll down the right side of the page to education, you'll see speaker series videos here. And you can go there and we go back recording these for about I think about 12 years or 13 years, something like that now. And here is our series for this year, and we are clearly at the end of this series. So this is our 29th year of doing this. So we'll be back next year, I'm sure. to go for 30. And yeah, so I want to admit that person. Our speaker tonight, Lincoln Payne, pretty well-known maritime historian. He's been an author, is an author, he's an editor, a curator. His books include award-winning The Sea and Civilization, Maritime History of the World, and Ships of the World, an historical encyclopedia. Um, Payne is president of the North American Society for Ocean History and a visiting scholar at the Center for Oceans and Coastal Law, University of Maine School of Law. And I know Lincoln that you've taught some classes with or worked with Paul Mayuski, a friend of mine, who's a glaciologist there and
Yep.
former director of the Coastal Studies, not the Coastal, the Climate Studies Center, who's now over in Scotland. Paul's been a speaker of ours as well over the years. Um, from 2009 to 2012, Lincoln was guest curator and archivist at the Norman H. Morse collection of ocean liner materials at the Ocean Map Library down at the USM, Southern Maine. He's chair of the board of the Maine Maritime Museum in Bath, which has been named one of the 10 best maritime museums in the world. And Lincoln has lectured on topics across the board, across the broad spectrum of maritime enterprise, including literature of the sea, um, exploration, museum curatorship, decorative arts, maritime law, trade, and naval history. He's been a frequent guest in academic settings. Lincoln has spoken at Nova, University of Lisbon, Ocean University of China, uh, Leiden University in the Netherlands, Tulane Law School, Tufts, College of the Atlantic, Naval War College, and the U.S. Naval Academy, among others. He's participated in public affairs forums, including the Commonwealth Club of California, and Times of India Lit Trust, as well as frequently addressing meetings of the North American Society for Oceanic History, the International Maritime History Association, and the World History Association. Um, Lincoln Payne graduated from Columbia College in New York, BA in Latin, has helped organize 4 tall ship events so far. Before turning to writing full time, he spent 14 years as a nonfiction and reference book editor in New York. And I want to thank Harold Prince, who lives down in the lower part of the bay, for suggesting I contact Lincoln to speak this evening. The speaker series runs October to May. It's free. It's on the second Wednesday of each month. And we are doing it now via Zoom because of COVID and works. It's very convenient, honestly, for me. It's convenient for a lot of people. It's convenient. It facilitates us bringing in speakers from out of the area, which is really nice. But there are those of us who do miss getting together personally. We will have a summer outside series starting up at some point soon. And we'll put that up on the website and send out postcards and all that about that. And we will have a sort of annual meeting has transitioned to a kind of coincident with a farm tour thing. So we can get together then when the weather's good. Getting a little echo. It's probably from Lincoln's phone. I'm not sure, but if that's on still, on speaker. But anyway, Lincoln, I'm going to stop sharing and you can have at it. And well, I'll keep my audio on for a minute and we'll make sure that we're hearing you and then I'll mute myself as well. Questions and answers, we'll deal with those at the end. If you can use the chat box feature, that'll be great. And I'll moderate questions or Martin and I will, or Lincoln will if he's into it as well. So thank you.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, um, especially because it gives me an opportunity. As Ed said, I was on the board of the Maine Maritime Museum, and I was on the board when the Friends of Merry Meeting Bay facilitated the museum's purchase of the cruise boat Merry Meeting, which allows us to tell the cultural and environmental history of the Kennebec, the Sagadahoc, and Merry Meeting Bay itself. And it's really been a great thing for us to be able to have our own vessel and to take museum goers of all ages, from students and to grandparents. So thank you guys very much for that.
Well, if I can interrupt, let's make sure we're giving credit where credit is due. We may have provided a letter of support, but that was probably mostly the Mary Meeting Bay Trust, which is not us.
Oh, it
So,
is.
so,
Oh, well,
so they probably deserve a lot of credit. We might get a little check box, for saying,
well,
yeah,
thank you for keeping Merry Meeting Bay front of mind for a lot of people and preserving it and keeping
yeah.
it from being destroyed,
Well, thank
as
you. And we have
so many other
narrated,
bodies of water have been.
yeah, we have narrated a lot of those cruises. So,
Yeah. So it's also great to see a couple of old friends, some very old friends, and some not quite so old. Thanks for signing on for this cruise today. Um, so this evening, I'm going to give you a very cursory overview of some of the maritime activities that people undertook across the world's third largest continent over the course of about 15,000 years. Though, in point of fact, we don't really know how many thousands of years, but we'll just use that as the baseline. This history, to me, is exciting and revealing in its own right because Indigenous Americans were doing some very cool things in and on the water very early on with watercraft, fisheries, infrastructure, trade, and warfare. And their maritime activities had a profound and demonstrable impact on the way that Europeans and other newcomers approached the continent in the 16th century, and in fact, ever since then. To take only one example, anyone who has a canoe or kayak, which I imagine is a fair number of people involved with the Friends of Merry Meeting Bay, are indebted to literally hundreds of generations of patent-free indigenous practice and refinement. Native practice has also had and continues to have a significant impact on the law in both the United States and Canada, especially with respect to issues of sovereignty and the environment. So, in short, the indigenous maritime history of North America has something for almost everyone. But the question is, if this is also fascinating, why hasn't it gotten more attention? And I think there are two reasons chiefly. The first is that people still tend to think of maritime history in terms of big European ships and their long voyages and their big battles. But the other is that Americans are raised on a diet of Westerns, novels, comics, TV shows, and movies that take place in the arid West. And in caricaturing or celebrating the last years of Native American resistance to white encroachment, popular culture situates indigenous people about as far from the inland and coastal waters where their ancestors prospered for thousands of years. The areas of greatest population in pre-contact North America were the Pacific Coast, the Mississippi Valley, and the Southeast. So if we swapped out Westerns for Southeasterns or Arctics, for instance, that would attune us to a far wetter and more accurate impression of the Native American past than we get in popular culture. So, telling the story of a relatively small and widely dispersed populations over millennia poses some narrative challenges, especially when you only have about 40 minutes to do it. So, we are going to move around a bit, but these are the main cultural areas we're going to be covering. The American Arctic, as you can see, snakes around from southern Alaska to the northern coast of Canada and the Arctic archipelago in Greenland. Then there's the subarctic, which we'll talk a little bit less about, except in the Northeast. The California, the Northeast, somewhat a little bit about the plains, but mostly the Southeast are the really sort of important places. And the Westerns all took place in the Plateau Plains, Great Basin, and Southwest. And that's where our attention has always traditionally been focused. So we'll start up in the Bering Sea area, up in here, and then move sort of south and then east and then southeast, and then we'll start skipping around a bit. and we'll wind up finishing up, excuse me, in the Arctic. Um, so, no written evidence, a sparse archaeological record, different ideas about how the last ice age ended, alternative assumptions about why megafauna like mammoths died out, and conflicting interpretations of linguistic and genetic evidence contribute to uncertainty about when people first arrived in the Americas. But there is growing consensus around the broadest conclusions, namely that the founding populations originated in Northeast Asia and reached North America at the end of the Ice Age around 15,000 years ago. At the time, because there was so much ice, sea levels were roughly 400 feet lower than today, and Northeast Asia, Alaska, and the Yukon comprised a 2,000-mile wide subcontinent known as Beringia. And in uh, in terms of latitude, it extended from the New Siberian Islands in the northwest, south to the Chamchatka Peninsula, and then across the eastern third of the Bering Sea to the Alaska Peninsula in the southeast. So this green stuff was all probably dry land, or possibly moister in the south and more dry in the north. So the predominant theory these days is that people came via a kelp highway. And this hypothesis holds that the first migrants followed the southern fringe of Beringia, um, perhaps starting in Kamchatka, and lived off the vast, ecologically diverse edible seaweed forests that also sheltered an astonishing array of marine animals, shellfish, fish, and birds. So once south of the ice, some people undoubtedly went ashore to begin the process of exploring and settling the previously unpeopled continent, while others continued south by sea. And turning east would have been, you can see this little arrow here. This is basically just around Puget Sound, is where the Cordilleran ice sheet ended. So people could have poked in there and spread across the northern side, or they could have kept going down further. Um, the evidence for coastal migration is pretty strong, though, because of two facts in particular. The first is that in 1959, the remains of a person dating to 13,500 years ago was found on the island of Santa Rosa off Santa Barbara. And somewhat later, archaeologists discovered that 700 years before that, there were people living in south central Chile, more than 8,000 miles to the south. And by one estimate, it took about 2,500 years for people to reach Chile, which is a rate of about 32 miles per decade, which is far too fast for overland migration at the time. So when and where people began turning south of the ice is in, not entirely clear, but they almost certainly followed rivers that carried them to within miles of the Continental Divide. And the two most promising avenues would have been the Columbia River in the north and the Colorado River in the south. And once east of the Continental Divide, of course, you have more or less unimpeded access to the Great Plains, the Mississippi Valley, the Great Lakes area, the Gulf Coast, and beyond them, the Southeast, the Atlantic coastal plain, the Northeast, and interior Canada. So, while rising sea levels would have drowned coastal sites, evidence of early migration along the Columbia River, let me just go back here for a second, would have been completely eradicated by this thing called Glacial Lake Missoula, which was formed when a tongue of ice um, slid across a canyon and backed up the equivalent of the volume of Lakes Ontario and Lake Erie um, in Montana. And then when the ice melted and the dam burst, it's estimated that the lake drained in about 3 days. So it was flooding out at about 60 miles an hour and basically took everything like 200 feet of topsoil with it and exploded it out into the Pacific um, for scores, if not hundreds of miles. So no evidence probably survived that. Um, Further south, you have the Colorado River, which people would have reached either going directly west from Baja California or making their way along the coast and then back up. And there are many tributaries there that can bring you to within feet practically of the continental divide. Um, Let me see here. This is just outside of Boulder, basically. This is where the Colorado rises, um, but you can also get to um, the Arkansas River by the Gunnison River, and probably the most obvious would have been the Gila River, which gets you to within about 60 miles of the Rio Grande. So, the other thing that happened was in the east, you had the ice stubbornly held on for a long time. And then when it started melting, it started flooding things that had been basically crushed below the level that the landscape that had been crushed below the level that it is now until it started rebounding. So you had, for instance, this enormous Lake Algonquin, which took over or covered most of two or three of the Great Lakes. You had a much bigger Lake Ontario. You had a thing called the Champlain Sea. And as the land began to rise again after the pressure of the ice had been removed, uh, water started flowing instead of from the Atlantic inland, it started flowing from inland out to the Atlantic down the St. Lawrence, and things began to dry up a bit. So, less violent examples of topographic change would have been the Gulf of Maine, which at the height of the last ice age was mostly land. Um, Also, Chesapeake Bay and vast chunks of the or swaths of the Gulf Coast from Texas right around to Florida. The coastline extended much farther south than it does today. So, what kinds of vessels people used in the Paleolithic and the Archaic periods is an open question simply because the oldest watercraft that have been found are barely 5,000 years old. But the fact that they had watercraft at that early time or before 5,000 years ago is obvious from the fact that they're simply things that can't be done without boats. The people could not be on the Channel Islands off of California, for instance. And as one author has put it, while archaeologists may ignore the existence of boats because they haven't found any, North American anthropologists seem to take water travel for granted as a key element of life. And I'm not an anthropologist, but you can put me in that camp fairly squarely. So, one of the things you need for different types of boats is trees, either dugouts. You need very large trees that can be hollowed out. For birch bark canoes, you would need to actually have access to birch bark. And that about 10,000 years ago, the only birch bark was in a very small refuge up here in the far northwest tip of North America. And as you can see, it gradually spread east and south. Um, so birch bark canoes would have been made over a light frame and tied together with animal sinews or roots. But the birch bark canoe would have followed an earlier development, which was skin boats, same exact principle. The difference being that in the high Arctic, where there are no trees, the frames would have been made either from walrus or whale bone. At this early point, stuff that had been scavenged and washed ashore rather than hunted, and also driftwood, which would make its way up along into the Bering Sea. So when people were sort of presented with this new environment, it was warmer, more trees, they gradually began to abandon the very highly hunter-gatherer, highly mobile hunter-gatherer way of life that typified the Paleo-Indian period. And while in the Archaic period, which starts about 10,000 years ago, 8,000 years ago, the people remained fisher, hunter, gatherers. They tended to move seasonally and over shorter distances. Um, and this allowed for things like faster population growth and the ability to take on longer term projects. Um, and these included making dugouts, which, as I said, required big trees, but also an ability to control fire and a thing called the Dalton adze, a stone tool that first appears at the start of the Archaic. Um, and the more settled lifestyle was, as I said, a precondition for building dugouts, just because it took probably twice as long as it did to build a skin boat or a birch bark vessel. So this image is very famous. If you have ever seen an image of early Indians building a dugout, it's probably this one. It's 1588 from an English trip to North Carolina. And you can see they're burning the base of the tree to topple it. And then they use fire also to take off the bigger limbs. And then they put fire coals along the center line, and then as that chars the wood, they scrape the wood away. So this is technique, even though it's the 16th century, probably differs little from the way the oldest known dugouts were constructed. And the oldest ones we have are a group from Wisconsin that was found literally about 3 years ago, and Florida. And these were made from a wide variety of trees, including red and white oak, elm, black walnut, cottonwood in the Mississippi Valley, southern pine and bald cypress, and others. So dugouts were also used extensively on the Salish Sea. The Salish Sea refers to the area of the Strait of Juan de Fuca, Puget Sound, and Queen Charlotte Sound in Washington State and British Columbia. And dugouts were also used extensively up through southeastern Alaska, where by the time Lewis and Clark got there, boat ownership was practically universal. And also the Nuu-chah-nulth, or the Nootka, Vancouver Island, and the Haida were very celebrated for their dugouts, which they actually built for trade to other tribes. And these were not small vessels. Standard trading, whale hunting, and sort of warfare vessels could be 40 feet by 6.5 feet across, and they could take 20 to 30 people plus cargoes or their gear, but some are known to have reached 80 feet in the 19th century. Smaller vessels called family canoes carried about 10 to 15 people, and the smallest ones tended to be around 12 feet long, which is still very big. And typically they were painted and adorned with carved sculptures of people and animals, not unlike Western vessels were. So, although fishing, hunting, and gathering remained the dominant mode of subsistence in North America until a little more than 1,000 years ago, watercraft enabled groups to enlarge their foraging radius and to move easily between villages and seasonal hunting or fishing grounds. And because canoes facilitated communication and trade, settlements grew up at or near landing places on rivers. And some of these became the nuclei of mound complexes, which were a central feature of Native American culture in the eastern United States. And it seems that the relationship between mound building and boat building was symbiotic. This map, as of 1894, shows what were then known to be the mound complexes of the eastern United States. This antedates the discovery of the very famous one of Spiro in Oklahoma, among others. And what's interesting is if you look at the constellation of red dots on here, they mostly follow the Mississippi, the Ohio, the Cumberland, the Tennessee, and other major rivers, the Illinois, the Fox, all up between the Mississippi and Lake Michigan, the Upper Missouri, and so on. So you can really trace, and also in Florida, you have the St. Mary's River down here. So river transportation was key to the situation of where mounds were, and rivers were essential for mounds to spread the culture. These are the two LSU campus mounds. These are the oldest man-made structures known in the Americas. Huey Long, when he was governor of Louisiana, ordained that the LSU campus would be built around these. Um, there's the LSU football stadium, and to the left here is the cage where they keep the LSU Tiger mascot. The age of these wasn't really realized until fairly recently, I'd say in the last 5 or 10 years. Um, these, as I said, these are the oldest man-made structures anywhere in the Americas, north or south. Here, further upriver, an hour or two, is the unfortunately named Poverty Point Mound Complex, which is about 3,300 years old. It's a fascinating place. Um, and it was built about 3,400 years old, as I said. It's a sort of 2 square mile area. And the largest of its mounds, Mound A up here, is 72 feet high, 705 by 640 feet at the base. And it's the biggest of the five mounds there. These are concentric rings, these hills, which may have been residences. And again, it's situated right here on Bayou Macon, which was a tributary of the Mississippi, which would have been much closer at this point. Um, a number of features suggest the importance of water transportation to this site. In the first place, Louisiana is a largely rock-free zone, but there are an estimated 71 metric tons of debris from stone imported from as far away as the Upper Mississippi, the Middle Ohio, and Cumberland rivers, as well as stone bowls from the Appalachians and copper from the Great Lakes area. Even more astonishing, and again, this is something that's only been discovered in the last 2 or 3 years, Mound A was apparently built in only 3 months. And estimates are that with the technology available at the time, there were no wheeled vehicles, no metal shovels, or any tools that could provide significant mechanical advantage. The mere raising of the mound would have required between 1,000 and 2,400 people. But how this would have been organized is a mystery because the way history is generally told, you can't have monumental projects like that unless you have an agrarian society with lots of surplus labor and a supreme ruler to command people to do what he wants. But Poverty Point's permanent population was a relatively small, subsistence-based community. And the estimates are that to support the 1,000 to 2,400 mound makers, they would have needed probably 7,500 other people to support the workforce. and watercraft would have been indispensable to get people to Poverty Point and also to expand the foraging radius required to feed everybody. So the country's largest mound complex is further up the river in Cahokia, which took off in about 1054, the year of the great supernova that seems to have inspired lots of change all over the world. Um, the center of what became known as Mississippian culture um, was spread its influence from Florida to the upper Midwest. And the speed with which it sort of appeared on the scene in the middle of the 11th century, it was so fast that it's known as the Big Bang, because everything from the architecture and the site planning, the agriculture, the craftsmanship, the religion, everything seems to have happened all at once and very fast. So, over 2 centuries, the people at Cahokia raised 81 mounds, including the country's largest, and its permanent population reached about 20,000 people. And this is all before about 1300. And to give you a sense of how significant that is, the next city in North America to reach that population was Philadelphia in the 1760s. And again, Cahokia's influence spread because of its location on the Mississippi, right there at the junction of the Missouri, just outside of St. Louis, and its proximity to the Ohio and the Indiana and Illinois and all sorts of other major streams. Another mound complex, different kettle of fish, is Mound Key, which was built by the Calusa, who dominated Southwest Florida for about 2,000 years, up until the coming of the Europeans. Mound Key started off basically as an oyster reef, and oyster shells were heaped in middens on top of that, starting around 1000 BC. And it grew from there. And then in about the 1300s, the Calusa built a pair of fish ponds, which were joined by the Grand Canal, as they call it. And the canal was closed off either by nets or by wooden gates. And this ensured that they could have access to a ready supply of fish. These were big fish ponds, by the way. The small one was 140 by 230 feet. And the other one was slightly larger. And this was not unique, again, to the Calusa. And in the 1540s, a member of the DeSoto expedition wrote about a canal that led from the Mississippi to an artificial lake in which the local chief kept fish for his eating and pastime, so that no matter how many times the nets were cast, there was never any lack of fish. So, um, these are actually rather late examples of Native American aquaculture, which is thousands of years old. The oldest and most widespread efforts, which are found worldwide, were the building of fish weirs, which could be made of rock, wooden stakes, or withies in streams and in coastal shallows. And the oldest known weir in North America was discovered in 2022 during a survey of submerged caves off Prince of Wales Island in southern Alaska. And this fish weir lies at a depth of 170 feet, and it's believed to be about 11,000 years old. And before that, the oldest known fish weir in North America was supposed to have been the Sebasticook Lake fish weir in Newport, but that's only 6,000 years old. The densest collection of fish weirs comes from a town called Comox on Vancouver Island. And there they found the remains of between 150 and 200,000 wooden stakes arranged in two very different uh, configurations. The older design had a relatively wide mouth to accommodate shoals of herring, and that was built around 1400 years ago. And then about 600 years later, during a cooling off period, these were replaced by narrow-mouthed fish weirs, which were better suited to capture salmon. And it's believed that this switch was due to the onset of the Little Ice Age and changes in fish migration patterns. So these weirs and traps were widespread across the rest of North America, especially in the Atlantic coastal plain and Piedmont um, along the fall line. And the weirs were tended according to the different types of species involved. Now, many Native American groups depended on fish, developed complex rituals to ensure the health of the catch. For some people, salmon are considered sacred animals that assume human form when they return to the ocean, and then they come back as fish to nourish the people. And some tribes greet the arrival of the first fish with elaborate ceremonies, and others observe sacred rites in the construction of weirs and fishing platforms. And, it's easy to dismiss this as sort of strange, not very sophisticated behavior, but the Massachusetts State House has an effigy of the sacred cod hanging into it by order of the government. And we also find people christening their boats, and fishermen often celebrate the blessing of the fleet. So it's a very common practice, in fact. The failure of salmon to appear, which did happen, could be catastrophic because the fish were often dried for use over the winter. But a successful run could be astonishingly bountiful. And in 1850, a group of white settlers in Northern California reported that the Klamath River was so thick with salmon that the horses refused to ford. Um, Another really fascinating type of aquaculture was the development of things called clam gardens, which started probably around 4,000 years ago, again in the Salish Sea region. And these were developed by raising a little rock wall at the low tide line and letting silt and dirt, mud, and other stuff collect behind it to increase the habitat for clams. One clam garden complex enclosed 28 acres of clam flats. And this could be done either on an existing beach or it was also done on completely bare rock. And it seemed to work either way. And again, there were lots of rituals associated with the clams, which it was believed if you took care of the clams would take care of you. Um, Closer to home, we have an estimated 2,000 shell middens on the coast of Maine that have been documented. And these are evidence of prolonged occupations and enormous consumption of shellfish. Indiantown Island near Booth Bay was occupied seasonally for about 4 months a year for 1,700 years. And the middens include the remains of some 35 million clams, or about 20,000 a year. Um, of course, in the Archaic period, there was also the development of sort of saltwater fishing, fin fishery, of cod, flounder, sea mink, and even some swordfish, perhaps. Although it seems that if there was swordfish hunting, it was done more for prestige than anything else. There is, however, a better documented and understood evidence of sword fishing among the Chumash people who lived in the Channel Islands of California and along the coast opposite. And what's interesting about these people is that they developed one of only two distinct planked boat types in the Americas. The other one was from Chile. And it seems like insane place for a planked boat tradition to have developed because there weren't any trees to speak of that could be used for planks. Um, and the wood for tomals, as they're called, had to be scavenged from driftwood coming down the coast on the California current. And the materials to sew them together and to tar them um, and waterproof them was imported from the coast. But this seems to have been something that developed around 500 CE, and evidence for that is in the stratification of Chumash society, which turns up in the archaeological record. And this sword fishery continued well into the historic period. So, as I mentioned earlier, the founding populations of North America came from Asia at the end of the Ice Age, and they turned south because the ice sheets were still there. But as these gradually started to melt and recede um, and assume something of their current character, about 5,000 years ago, the first people, the Inuits version of the first people, emerged out of Northeast Asia around 5,000 years ago. And within about 500 years of reaching Alaska, they started spreading inland. And by about 2500 BC, they had been the first people to settle the Arctic coast of North America, the Arctic archipelago, and even Greenland. And these people were succeeded by people of the Dorset culture who were more dependent on hunting marine mammals like seals and walrus, although they seem to have probably worked more from the ice than from boats. And the Dorset also made it as far south in the east, as far south as Labrador and Newfoundland, where they bumped up against the people of the Maritime Archaic tradition we found in Maine. And then about 1,500 years ago, a new archaeological culture emerged in the Bering Sea um, area, and which was notable for its emphasis on hunting walrus and seals. Walrus were hunted at haul-out locations where there were several where it's estimated that there were more than 10,000 walruses at a time clambering ashore. Um, and they from this sort of uh, ability of to hunt megafauna, people also started to hunt whales, and this seems to have been probably around 500 CE. And it required cooperative strategies for hunting because you had a bunch of different people in their own kayaks. But they also needed toggling harpoons. And what you can see here, sealskin air bladders that would be tied to the harpoon rope so that when the whale dove, it wouldn't be able to dive very far without exhausting itself. The last wave of migration came around 1300 or a little before, was the Thule people, and they came thundering across from Alaska to Greenland, and there they bumped into Greenlanders who'd come from Iceland to Greenland. Specifically, it seems to hunt walrus, which was very valuable for, again, skins and rope and for the ivory. And a lot of scientific studies have been done that demonstrate that a lot of the walrus ivy uh, figurines that are found in Western Europe actually come from the northern part of Davis Strait up here, and oops, and possibly also from this area of Fox Basin. And this would have been traded to the Greenlanders or the Norse Greenlanders by the Inuit. Um, and then that trade was the first between Native Americans and Native Europeans, and it died out because of the onset of the medieval, the Little Ice Age and the medieval period. Um, so that's basically the 14,000 year picture, 15,000 year picture of indigenous maritime history. Um, but it goes a long way, I think, to not only explaining, how things happened in North America, but also how well prepared Native Americans were to resist colonial encroachment. And yes, it's true that the Europeans overwhelmed native peoples, but we tend to telescope the history a lot, and it actually took 400 years for the Europeans to do that, despite the fact that the Indians had kind of laid out everything about how to go from place to place, what tools to use, including canoes, what were the best paths, what were the best portages, and the like. But you find very fierce resistance to the Spanish in Florida. Um, you find it in King Philip's War in the 1670s in New England. You find it in the first half of the 1800s with the Seminoles, who put up a 40-year fight against the U.S. Army using the highways and swamps of Florida. And this also, of course, explains the ease with which Native Americans took to British and U.S. Um, ships in the colonial and Federalist periods, because they were used to being at sea. And they were very well represented in the U.S. Merchant Marine, the U.S. Navy, and the forerunners of the Coast Guard. And in conclusion, I think one of the most important things about all of this is that maritime enterprise has been, despite the fact that we are sort of stuck in a Western mindset, Western movies, maritime resistance or enterprise has been kind of at the base of indigenous resistance and renewal, especially since the late 20th century. Um, because native lands were acquired more by treaty than outright conquest. Um, I mean, it was conquest, but it was accompanied by treaties. And the Constitution recognizes Native American tribes as sovereign nations. Um, Native Americans have been able to push back on violations of treaty rights with a lot more success in the federal courts than they've had with comparable issues at the state level. Um, and so there have been treaties dealing with fishing rights, for instance, since 1787 between the United States and the Seneca. Um, and there are still 16 tribes that have fishing rights in the Great Lakes, Upper Mississippi, and Ohio. Um, and it's really played out most noticeably in the Pacific Northwest, where in the 1850s, there were 7 treaties with various tribes in Washington and Oregon. And the so-called Stevens treaties, for the guy who negotiated them for the Americans, reserved for the tribes the right of taking fish at all usual and accustomed places and of erecting temporary buildings for curing them. And white settlers tried to block access to these accustomed places if they acquired the land. But between 1905 and 1977, the tribes litigated 7 cases before the Supreme Court, which they won. And this has been a very important thing, not only for domestic law, but also in the international realm, as the Maka, who are seen here in the early 1900s, stripping a whale, have sought to retain or revive their right to hunt whales, despite international prohibitions on whale hunting. But the indigenous people, I think quite rightly, argue that they have a different relationship to whales and the whale hunt than, say, commercial whalers, whaling nations like Japan and Norway, which go more for bulk. So, and these are the Maka people are the only one of the Stevens Treaty holders who reserve this right to whale, but they have very distinct understandings about the relationship of people and the sea that are very distinct from the Western tradition of dividing the sea coast and the water's edge into very discrete bodies where different types of law obtain. For the Makah, as well as for many other indigenous people around the world, um, the idea of the land and the sea being distinct entities does not apply. Um, and of course, in the Western societies, we have the 3 mile limit and we have exclusive economic zones and we have marine conservation areas. But the difference is that we generally think of these as pragmatic governmental prerogatives rather than as cultural tribal customs. But in fact, as I think the events of the last year in this country have shown, um, a lot of government is cultural and tribal and customary, and we should pay more attention to those customs. And we should respect people who have different ideas about how those customs, how customs work. So thank you very much. I'm sorry if I've run over a bit, but I'd be happy to take any questions if we have time.
That was great, Lincoln. Thank you, thank you so much. I'll start off. I got a point of information for you, and then a question. And we did have a question so far. One person was asking where that last photo was taken, and what, presumably what year with the macaw there. Um, but I don't know if
The macaw live in the extreme northeastern tip of the Olympia Peninsula in Washington State. It's basically the northwesternmost part of the lower 48 states.
and that would have been early 1900s, would you
Yeah.
say? Yeah, okay. No. I don't know if you know, but a number of years ago, I found what is the trace of the second, only the second prehistoric wooden fish weir in the state,
Really?
right here in Merrymeeting Bay. And I'll send you a couple of newsletter articles we wrote about it. Since built onto by colonial uh, folks. So, but the carbon dates are 3,600 years ago. And then the other dates were, I forget now, so, mid to late 1700s, early 1800s kind of thing.
Hmm.
So that's kind of cool. And but then the question, you probably remember the name. I don't remember the name. I found the book interesting. Archaeologist who was at the Smithsonian was one of the co-authors, talked about the idea of early peoples coming across the Atlantic, the North Atlantic,
Hmm.
following following the ice edge. And I know a lot of people in the field kind of poo-pooed that, but some people think it's kind of interesting. And I wondered if you're familiar with that or had read that or had any thoughts about.
I am familiar with it, and it is interesting, but I don't think it holds any water. The the number of things I've seen debunking it for a whole variety of reasons, not the least of which is that it's not clear that the ice pack would have gone that far or that it would have sustained the sort of variety of life that um, the proposed coastal kelp highway hypothesis
Mhm.
does. I mean, there are some interesting anomalies in the archaeological record, but I think also the DNA and linguistic evidence for an Asian origin is overwhelming.
Have you read about John Turk's book about paddling over from Japan, following that sort of northern Pacific arch or arc?
No, but I mean, the islands of Japan were inhabited what 30,000 years ago. So there's a very old maritime tradition there. And, we know that people have been floating around doing incredible things on the water for a very, very long time, usually in somewhat more forgiving environments than Alaska. But
Yeah. Well, he did do that paddle and wanted to show that it certainly could be done without
yeah,
all that much trouble either.
yeah. Well, another interesting thing is that there have been a lot of people who have decided it would be fun to walk or snowmobile across the Bering Strait in the winter. Um, and they've done it, in the last 30 or 40 years,
Mhm.
mostly since the breakup of the Soviet Union. But so the ice there is still formidable.
Yeah. Mm. And going back in that area, of course, way back, I know there's been a lot of tropical fossil evidence up there and so forth, and plants and animals. So at one point that was all pretty warm, but that was a long time ago. So, so I
That
don't,
was a ways back.
yeah, that was a way back. So, um, yeah, I'm not seeing any other questions here. Um, so everyone's just, I guess, quiet in awe, you know, what you told them or something,
Or asleep.
or asleep. Yeah. So we'll say last call on questions so we don't keep you too long. But I really appreciate, Tom is clapping. Um, um, I really appreciated the talk and program and your work on this. It's very fascinating. Do you know Kerry Hardy? You probably do, right?
I know the name, but I don't know him. No.
Well, he is a very good sort of eco-linguist, if you will, and
Hmm.
fascinated by Native American culture. And he wrote a book that you may have heard of called Notes on a Lost Flute or Notes
Yeah,
from.
I have that. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So he's a good artist as well. So that's a uh, fascinating book. So yeah. So okay, someone asking, can you provide a little more information on the mounds? That's a big topic, or a big question. Um,
Well, what kind of I can't provide that much information because it's not it's sort of a side um not a side hustle, but it's sort of a little bit away from the maritime aspect. But the mounds are very interesting. I mean, you've got a variety of different types. You have the sort of the monumental um, mounds, like at Poverty Point, where possibly Mound A is in the effigy of a bird. I don't remember if the Cahokia Monk's Mound is considered to be an effigy, but then you have very clearly effigy mounds in the Ohio uh, and upper Midwest, where you have serpent mounds and that kind of thing, where it's clear from an aerial view that the mounds were very carefully, essentially drawn to look like animal figures. And so they have some sort of religious context. But not all mounds were ritualistic, and some of them were simply built um, for people to live on, probably to keep them dry during, times of flooding, which would be problematic for a lot of people if they were building on rivers. Um, and that would certainly have been an issue in places like Louisiana. And I just came back from New Orleans yesterday, and I can report that there is sunlight and warmth elsewhere in the world.
okay.
Um,
So now some of these were burial mounds and some.
Some were burial mounds, but some were pretty demonstrably not burial mounds. Like Mound A at Poverty Point,
Mhm.
which they determined that it was built as fast as it was because by doing core samples, and they discovered that it was a dry season apparently, and it's the same kind of stuff all the way down for 70 feet.
So it's probably been too long to tell, but clearly the soil had to come from somewhere, it had to be moved with probably some sort of primitive wooden shovel or something. Um, but there must be, would there be, are there associated depressions, you're making a fish pond at the same time as you're making a mound?
Yeah,
Or is it
I'm not sure
shallow
about that.
excavation that just fills in over time?
Yeah. No, but I mean the archaeology of these things is pretty savvy and they can do absolutely remarkable things. They sift through and look for fish bones and they do all sorts of different types of tests on things that, radiocarbon dating, um, uh, thermoluminescence. I mean, all kinds of weird stuff. They look at coprolites, which are basically feces. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff that can tell you an enormous amount about what was going on, and to a certain extent, why, or they can at least infer.
Yeah. And I think I've seen several programs on public TV over the years about, at least some of the more well-known mound cultures. And it's pretty incredible. And so were most of those happening at sort of a similar time, or is there a long,
Well, I mean, as I said, LSU is about 9,000 years old, and they were building them up until the 1400s.
okay?
So it's a very esteemed tradition. And the real problem is, I sort of joke about us being subject to the Western and having that bias in our sort of background and thinking. And also there's the bias of, maritime history is just big European ships. Um, but there's also the fact that American indigenous history is just invisible to the average American, despite the fact that so many people live in California or Massachusetts or Nebraska or Tennessee or, all of these states, many of which have names that relate to water and water activities. And as you know from the, books on Maine place names, that, so many of the names we use on a regular basis have to do with fishing or fisheries.
Sure.
Um, So it's a real failure on the part of the education system,
Mhm.
private and public. It's not, one or the other.
Yep.
It's been a really bad job.
Where is it? Raise hand.
Okay. Anything else? A lot of people appreciating your talk here. Oh, was there any use of sail? Um,
Probably not until very, very late. And if there were, it's not recorded in any way. Nothing in pictographs. Um, there is the possibility that there were sails used on the Pacific coast between Ecuador and Mexico. Um,
Hmm.
but even that's sort of conjectural. But it seems that um, as soon as the Europeans showed up with sails, people hopped right on it. It was not, they didn't sort of sit around thinking, well, that's a strange device. They actually did it themselves, as did the Europeans. I mean, the Europeans didn't look at canoes and go, oh, well, those look frail. They jumped right in them, and that's how the fur trade operated, and that's how Canada was settled.
yeah,
Mhm.
voyagers, yeah. So, okay, great. Well, I'll let you go. Nothing else here. So thank you very much. Appreciate it. And
Thank you.
I'll send you a couple of newsletter articles about the weir out here. And
Terrific. I'd love to see them.
yeah, and yeah, let me know if you get up here to the Bay Area sometime and we'll get together. And,
Okay. And
right.
stay tuned. In 3 or 4 years, there might be a book.
Okay, cool. And
All right.
we'll send you, Martin and I will send you an email link when this is posted, and then you can pass it around if you want to, and so forth. So, okay,
Great. Well, thanks
all
so
right,
much for the opportunity to speak to you all tonight.
sure. And thanks again, Martin, for
Thank you.
this on.
Bye
Very
bye.
interesting. Thank you.
Y'all for coming.